we've got Amit, Andrew, Claudia, and Paul joining us for our panel session today. And everybody's off mute. Yep, almost.
Yes.
All right, so I will fire away. I will fire away with obviously a quick sort of a summary of what we've covered there. That we've covered quite an expanse of everything that needs to be considered in this topic around leveraging technology for food assurance. And now we want to do a bit of a deep dive into some of the key points that the speakers mentioned, but also in terms of the overall perspective that Peter set at the start. So I will just fire away. Obviously, there's enormous interest in and demand from the agricultural industry worldwide in the opportunity that technology presents for increasing productivity, profitability, and sustainability. The first question, what role does collaboration and the development of partnerships across the ecosystem and globally, including with farmers, with the private sector, researchers, and the government play? Claudia, if you could start us off.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thanks for having me. And my short answer would be, it's absolutely important, right? You heard Bradley talk about the challenges we're facing. We're trying to produce more with less land, with less resources, with less labor, and by the way, in more uncertain conditions. So how is this going to work? It's not something that one government, one organization can solve alone. From a technology perspective, we see technology playing an absolutely important role in helping making better decisions. And this doesn't matter if this is about more precision farming, recognizing a pest, food safety. We talked a lot about those different things. It's really about enabling better decisions. And this is done by data aggregation. It's about bringing data together in a way that can be analyzed and accessed. And that's really one of the things we're doing with FarmBeats, and where we provide an open ag data platform where others can build solutions on top of it. But I want to mention quickly on, we have initiatives on the societal side where we want to bring technology to rural farming, and here we work both with commercial partners, but also with the government. And just to give you one example, there is a technology called TB Whitespace to transmit data on farm, and don't want to go technical, but we need to have the government's help to change regulations so we can take advantage of those things. We work on sort of educating farmers to work with technology, and then on the innovation side, we really work closely with universities and research organizations, because there's not enough data scientists in the world to develop AI models and advanced analytics as quickly as we needed to really make those changes in digital farming.
Great. And other panelists, your thoughts on the same subject?
Well, look, and look, I'd maybe just like to leverage on what Claudia said. We certainly don't have enough data scientists to work in that space. I don't think we have enough richness of data yet either. And I would say some of it does come back to, and this might sound like it's contrary to what Paul just said about we don't need more standards. We need standards in different spaces, right? We don't need standards in the supply chain traceability. GS1 covers that beautifully. But we do need standards, not even necessarily IT standards. We need standards of how we measure things so that we know we're talking about the same things. You know, if you're talking about animal welfare or some of the sustainability metrics, we can also the same top level words, but what it actually means underneath in terms of practices and behaviours and what's happening to crops or animals or nutrients can be completely different. We don't yet have enough data to be able to reliably compare between systems and say, actually, you're doing that really well, or the long-term consequences of what you're doing are not that great. So we don't just need more data scientists, we also need more data for them to work with.
Great. Anyone else have any more thoughts on partnerships and collaboration, both locally and globally?
Yeah, no, I just want to add to what Claudia and Andrew just referenced. You know, if you look at some of the most powerful outcomes that we can achieve, whether it's use of data, and you know, Paul, actually, I really like that statement, Paul. It's not about the data, right? Data means nothing. It's really about information that helps you make decisions, right? And I think unless you're part of an ecosystem, no pun intended, not for us. But unless you're part of an ecosystem, you can't actually do much with that because you're going to be sitting in isolation and it doesn't mean much, right? So it's very different from the old days when you had information sitting on your PC and you were doing things. So that this is actually being, bringing more efficiency, better customer outcomes, and overall achieving bigger, higher impact goals across the value chain. And that's not going to happen if you don't have the right partnerships and the ecosystem. And that in today's world, especially with emerging tech, I think is not just the technology companies or customers and so on. You've got to be looking at other sort of agencies or organizations, or even universities, for example, that are actually trialing new sort of solutions. So it's going to be part of those ecosystems.
Yeah.
So Peter, that was a big part, I think, of the Agritech ITP launch the other day. A big part of that conversation, wasn't it? Was about partnerships and collaboration.
Yeah, absolutely, Janet. If I could just add to one or two of the comments that have been made, and a really good example based on what Andrew said around data standards. This is a classic example of where within the Agritech industry transformation plan, there is a very specific work stream being set up to look at ag data standards and regulation. And what's going to happen there is that clearly, normally this would be kind of run by government, but we're going to have an industry support group that will work with government to ensure that industry has its input. And what we found through the whole process of the Agritech ITP is that by getting collaboration from not just industry and government, but also bringing in research organizations and other parties, we've had significant buy-in to the opportunity. And so going forward, the fact that you've got that entire ecosystem working together, there's much more chance of the main goals and aims of the plan succeeding. So certainly I think our experience, and I do get calls, including from Singapore, from other countries, asking whether they can replicate the type of ecosystem we've built here, because they can see the value of government, industry, and research working together. So hugely valuable.
Bradley?
Thanks, Janet. I mean, and just building on what Peter said, I mean, I think ecosystem builders, in a sense, like what Peter is creating with Agritech New Zealand and what Singapore has done, are hugely essential, right? And I was kind of surprised at how interested so many of these startups and beyond startups and pretty mature companies, ventures in the agritech space were appreciative of what we were doing within the UN, trying to help them scale and bring them to different markets around the world. Because I had assumed that many of these would already have the means, to access these markets. But so we're in a sense playing the sort of aggregator of ecosystems role within the United Nations in this instance. Again, some of these are big and very well-known companies, but we offered no financial incentive to them to be part of this initiative, but they just very much appreciate the broad network of offices and countries and markets and things. So just to say, to the point, I mean, yes, the collaboration between all sorts of different entities is absolutely essential to make any impact here, I guess.
Great. Paul probably has something to add to that.
I was just going to echo what Andrew said, actually, because I agree. I think GS1 as a data standard for supply chain and a common business vocabulary has nailed it. So I don't want to spend much time on that. But I agree, we're not seeing enough data yet. So I think I made the comment, take as much data as you can get. You don't know what you're going to do with it yet. Machine learning is getting cheap. AI is coming off quantum computing. So we'll get a much better sense of what these data models mean. And I agree, there's just not enough data scientists. So let's get the data there into systems. Cloud storage is cheap, and start building ML models around the big issues. So food loss, food waste, for example, is a big one that ML machine learning right now can really benefit. And they're starting to see a lot of data because you're starting to be able to map what's going on in markets versus what's happening on the supply chain and start mapping the gaps. So I think, yeah, the challenge is people claiming or credence claims and definitions of animal welfare or organic or sustainable or regenerative farming. It depends where you live in the world is what that means. So I think that's the standards we're still yet to see, and that'll be driven, again, by all the data. that we still are in the early stages of collecting.
Yep. And I was just going to add to that, thinking along the collaboration line and perhaps picking up a bit on what Peter and Bradley have said, is we need to collaborate internationally as well. So it's great that New Zealand Agritech ITP has got a data stream. And the exciting thing about that is we're not just looking at how that plugs into the New Zealand ecosystem, but we need to collaborate internationally on that, because otherwise it's wasted. And the second thing is we need to make sure that we're collaborating not just with technologists and data scientists and software people, but we're actually talking to social researchers, and we're talking to traditional biologists and chemists, because they know a whole lot more of this stuff than our models will flick out.
So that conversation around the collaboration and the partnerships is obviously around the why behind that is the consumer, and so we talked about the consumers looking for different things in terms of the products that they buy, and we've had mentioned the climate change, biodiversity loss, degradation of waterways, and other things, and the importance of sustainability. And so why don't we talk specifically around some of the challenges in that space? So the importance of data and technology and leveraging it, but specifically the challenges and opportunities around ensuring quality, food safety, and being still able to be responsive as well to consumer demand. If someone wants to kick off, Paul?
You're muted.
Better unmute technology, NZ Techweek. I think consumers, they have that minimum hygiene standard of safety and trust, and brands really need to leverage both data and character. And the reason I summarize the problems in food assurance as being bad character or bad data is that either someone's trying to do the wrong thing, or they don't have enough points of reference to do the right thing. They're not capturing quality results or test results. They're not QA locking before they get biological tests back or pathological tests back. Or there's insufficient data around spray residues in some crops in some countries. So to me, it's either a data or a character problem. And you can't fix character. If someone's going to try and do the wrong thing, you won't stop them trying to do the wrong thing. You've just got to use systems and processes to catch them, and then make sure they bear the ultimate consequence of trying to hurt their fellow humans. So, a good jail sentence will do a counterfeiter a load of good. But to catch them, you need really good data, and to catch recalls before they happen, and to manage food loss and food waste is all that, I think, data in, data out assessment. And then you can get onto the more interesting data around how do I define animal welfare? What is my robust objective standard around animal welfare? And if I'm going to make a claim that I'm really good to my animals before I kill them, then I need to be able to evidence that with some meaningful objective data set. And so the consumer, if they stop trusting a brand or a country or a production process, they will simply stop buying products. And the Johnson & Johnson asbestos-laden talcum powder is a good example of just a massive waste of enterprise value off a simple fact they weren't testing enough data. And if they had been testing enough and had the data, they could have avoided a consumer health scare. So I think ultimately Agritech needs to focus on the consumer. No consumer, no customer, no sales, no business. So if you can't give the consumers assurance and the information they desire, and the only way we're going to do that is to start building sensible data sets. And I'm not sure we'll ever get competitors collaborating with each other, for example, or even separate industrial systems collaborating with each other. What we can do is make sure the data is available to the consumer in some way, and let the consumers make their choices based on sensible, objective, available information.
Can I just add to what Paul was saying? I think it's also really critical to have, you can't have these pieces again in isolation, right? Because it's not going to serve much of a purpose. It's got to be institutionalized. There has to be some accountability at the top of the pyramid. So as an example, and we'll probably touch on this later on today in the session at the FinTech session, because that's on sustainability. But SGX, for example, the Singapore Exchange, has actually made it mandatory for companies to report on their sustainability practices, right? So you have to institutionalize that. Paul shared the example of Johnson & Johnson. I mean, if organizations, it has to start at the top, because the little guys can keep doing what they're doing, but it doesn't really make that much of an impact. It's got to start at the top and the others will follow. So I think there has to be some level of consistency in how all of this is being reported. Sustainability is not just climate and environment. Obviously, it's fair wages, ethical practices, and so on. And consumers are getting more aware and more conscious, and they want to be making the right choices. So if we make brands accountable, then and leverage all the technology and the data, then it makes it much more meaningful.
Yep. Yeah. I'll just jump in to follow on Amit's comments too, if I may. So there's all this data, speaking of data, around the remarkable preferences of the current generation or the upcoming generation, Gen Z, right? I think McKinsey did an important study of their preferences on sustainability, and it's arguably the first generation that is making huge life changes in terms of where they're going to work, what job they're going to perform, what they're going to consume, really with sustainability as a primary driver, right? So I would wager, that within a shortish period of time, within a couple of years, there'll be something like a sustainability rating for businesses, even SMEs, that will be important, that it'll have the same sort of value as a, say, credit rating, right? Or even more of a value. So I think the sustainability it's not just a sort of fad, it's not CSR, it's core, right? And the pandemic has brought that even more to the fore. So I think it's onto something, and I think it has to be in all discussions around food and everything else, frankly.
I was just going to sort of jump from what Paul was saying around, it's a pretty hard ask on the farm. So on the farm, that conversation around needing all of that data and having that data available for consumers, it comes all the way back to actually on farm and those farmers having the ability to deliver on that. I mean, in countries there's a lag in connectivity. Farmers don't have the skills, and actually the technology really isn't there on farm. So I wonder, Claudia, if you've got some sort of Microsoft, I know, is working really hard in this space. You've got a number of solutions. You've mentioned Farm Beats. I mean, the solution really, in order to be able to deliver against any call mark or any information to consumers, you need the data, and you need aggregated data, and you need the tools and technologies on the farm to deliver on that.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's really why we wanted to focus on farm level data in the first place, because it feeds through everything in the supply chain, no matter if you want to address food safety issues, supply chain challenges, even things like automation. So it's a high priority. Like I said, I think for us, it's a combination of enabling technology on farms. We also understand that not every farmer is going to have like high tech on their farm or sensors or really rich information, but that's why it's so important to create the system of data where you have some really valuable field level data coming from sensors, coming from probes, and then you're able to mash that up with more readily available data such as satellite information. And by creating those systems, we can draw insights over whole regions. And I think that's a very important concept, because I personally don't think we'll see a place where, like I said, everyone is highly technologized on a farm. I don't see one system like just a QR code or just a sensor being the answer. I think it's a combination of those technologies. And just to give you an example, on the food safety side, I completely agree with Paul. The current system is just completely not functionable. But it's this is also about being able to predict where is a higher risk, where do we need to run audits, where do we need to have field level probes by using AI, by using machine learning to detect where the highest risk is. So it's a combination of those technologies.
That's right. Yeah, and that's a good point. It goes to the timeliness and the precision of what you're talking about. At the moment, most of the supply chains around the world, you're auditing for these really important credence issues. They happen every 3 years or maybe every 18 months because of the cost and the time and its manual process. And we need to get beyond that. Otherwise, as Paul says, that leaves too many gaps for the bad players, or not just the bad players, the players without data or sufficient controls. And so then we move to sensors and devices and measuring, and you can't. Farmers are not going to be able to instrument every paddock or every field with all the sensors that they'd love to. And so we do need to find ways of using remote sensing and combination technologies like AI to fill in the gaps. Bang on.
That's a really nice segue actually into the investment that needs to be made on farm, and actually in terms of other stakeholders involved in that conversation along the supply chain. Emerging technology innovation has obviously the potential to be great in terms of its application, but also following the hype and trends can lead to actually suboptimal decisions. So we've heard about machine learning and the fact that we're really sort of far off real, true, natural AI, and we've also heard about blockchain and the cloud. How can those working in and looking to invest in this space in terms of leveraging technology for the agricultural industry, mitigate hype and manage expectations to avoid making the wrong strategic decisions? I wonder if Amit, you could start us off with that, please.
Sure. Thank you, Janet. Where do I begin? I mean, there are so many possibilities in terms of what we can do. But obviously, it's about picking the right technologies at the right time, and putting it in context of your business. If you just consider what we've discussed over the last 1 hour, right? When you look at technology, if you're looking, let's use the industry term farm to fork, right? And you look across the value chain, you're talking about, devices, IoT sensors, analytics, data, machine learning, so many different things. It's not one simple solution. So it is a very, very complex ask. I think it's very confusing for companies when they're trying to make these decisions, and especially for for farms who are really focused on their core business. But I think it also depends on what technologies you're considering to implement and what stage they're at in their journey, right? If they're early stage, it's really key to be part of some parts of some ecosystem or some research organizations. Universities have incubator programs. You can be part of proof of concepts, POCs, learn from that ecosystem. That's a good way to start. If it's really early stage, if it's a more commercialized mainstream technology, that's where it becomes much more challenging, because it's not just about the investment you're going to make in the technology. It's about changing the way you operate your processes internally and externally with the rest of the ecosystem. Again, so I mean, there's a few things to consider. I think it has to be an outside-in view first. You have to look at the external factors, right? And the external factors, really involve, first of all, learning from others' experiences, leveraging peer group research to see how other companies, similar organizations, how have they deployed these solutions? How have they benefited? Did they actually benefit? What were the pain points that they solved with these technologies? Are those aligned with the pain points you're hoping to solve? Or are there other better alternative technologies or solutions to look at? Who are the right vendors to work with? Because again, the complexity of dealing with a solution that involves an IoT platform, sensors, a data platform, and so on. It's just so many choices to be made. Who are the right partners to work with? How much should you be budgeting? Are you actually budgeting just for the implementation, or are you actually factoring in that there is going to be a lot of cost that may not be part of your initial implementation cost, but part of operational costs? So I think you've got to consider that. And then eventually, I think you have to look internally to evaluate whether does the technology actually align with your business goals, or are you getting caught up in the hype because everyone else is doing it? In this digital world and social media world, we see so much all the time. I learned a new term actually last year, and I was probably a bit late in the game learning that term. It's called FOMO, it's the fear of missing out. And that's not a reason to invest in technology. It's got to be focused on your business goals. Second, do you have the skills, or can you skill people in your organization to actually drive that? And there's a whole different conversation. I'd love to have at a separate time if we had time on how, and Paul had that in his slides, how you can use technology to actually create alternative skill sets, especially for farms, because technologies like digital twin and virtual reality can actually help you with that. But do you have skills to implement those technologies? And then finally, most important, is it going to integrate, and is it interoperable? Is it going to work with your entire digital value chain? Because it's got to work with your suppliers, your customers, and your partners. So I think there's a whole bunch of things to consider, but I've tried to summarize it. I think it's got to be an outside-in view.
Anyone else?
Yeah, well, go
You
ahead.
have recorded.
No, I'd love to comment, because I think what we're seeing in agriculture is actually a digital transformation we've seen in other industries as well. It's almost like an evolution. A lot of what's happening right now is the pure instrumentation or the pure data collection that really needs to happen before we can really, and I think Paul said this in the beginning, have this enough data to run analytics, to see the patterns, to look into predictive analytics. Where it really should go is into creating those digital feedback loops. But because you talked earlier about consumer and the demand that consumer have, I think there is a future where it's more about personalized diets. We even see this with animal feeding today, more personalized nutrition. But if you're not able to collect this feedback, you'll never really get to a stage where you can do this thing. So for me, it's an evolution. But what I also want to say, I kind of disagree that we need to wait the next 10 years, because I see there's organizations that create a digital twin of a chicken barn, even of a chicken gut, to see how the gut is processing food. So if you frame sort of your challenge, the challenge you want to address, I think you can get to success really quickly, but you always want to have in mind what's the is it animal welfare? Is it about ethical growing food? Is it about sustainable measurements? And so you need to be aware of the goals you want to accomplish.
And I think just to add to that, I think all of us have seen a number of revolutions in terms of what technology will do. I'm certainly old enough to remember the internet revolution. And I think we've been through a lot of hype cycle now, and we're starting to get to the real juice around what will work, and we're starting to see a lot more standardization and cooperation. I'm reminded of the old investment adage that if you don't understand it, you shouldn't buy it. And I think that's the truth. I find agri businesses understand their business pretty well. Certainly a lot better than I would as a technology vendor. So if we can't make that digestible as a technology, then we shouldn't be trying to insert that extra complexity into a supply chain. We're meant to be solving problems, not creating new ones. And I think when you see these hype cycles, often during the hype, it creates a whole lot of process problems and wasted money before you start to see what's going to work in reality. I think the thing we've all missed, and this might be because we're all technologists, is actually there's the big education part on farm. We talked about on farm before, and while technology can help with education, I think creating simpler, easier solutions and educating farmers all over the world. It's easier to talk in the New Zealand context because farmers do care about their land. There's a sense of kaitiaki, that guardianship that comes with being a New Zealander. And so we're very proud of that. And in fact, it's in the ITP, I think, Peter. And we forget that there's huge, vast tracts of arable land and in the African continent and actually throughout Asia, where there isn't much penetration of technology yet, and so we've got to be educating other food systems why they need to have this data, making it really simple to use, and using predictive analytics off drones, off satellites. As you said, Claudia, start predicting where the problems are, because since you can't get a broad brush approach, you've got to start focusing on the squeakiest wheel in terms of where those production problems are, and start working on those, ultimately for the greater good. So I think we all need to remember education is a big part of tech and digitalization.
Just picking up on Claudia's point and then connecting it with yours, Paul, is if we were a business and we were looking at some new emerging tech, you build an IT team. If you don't want to outsource it, you build an IT team. You get a couple of a farmer doesn't do that. So the farmer has to leverage partnerships, and and I guess in New Zealand it's quite popular to sort of have cooperatives, cooperation rather between different entities. But I wonder what the model is. What is the model for the agricultural industry? I mean, do you outsource to a big player? Do you partner? Do you build an IT team within the farm? I mean, it's the same. It's having the same impact the technology is, but the model, in order to be able to adopt technology and on a continuous, you don't want to go out and actually invest and then come back a few years later and realize you need to upgrade. So how do you keep that continuum of continuous improvement with technology happening on farm? Andrew, any thoughts? He's writing it.
Yeah, I've got my Sharpie and my Post-it notes, and I was writing down some thoughts.
How do you do it?
Well, so here's one point: is when we talk about hiring an IT team or any equivalent team, any of the people who help with change management and adoption and new technology, it comes back to business scale, right? So if you're a cooperative turning over $1 billion a year, then you're going to have one sort of set of expenditure that you can make on that sort of thing, and you'll do an investment based on value. If your farm turning over $1 million a year, then and most of that's turnover and your profit margin's fairly small, your ability to invest in those values is going to be much more limited. If you're a farmer in Africa and you're in tens of dollars a year, your ability to invest is also going to be limited. And we have to take those things into account. What I was jotting down was, and it really comes off the education and accessibility side, because I think simplicity of technology and ease of use of technology and accessibility, they're different, but they all go together, right? I had two examples just this morning. I had a call with some people who were looking at data for sheep farming in Armenia, which is an interesting place to be looking at that. And again, the ability to invest versus the outcomes that you can get if you get the improvement from having some of the data. But simplicity is key. There's language barriers. If you can give them the data, can they do anything with it, or are they going to be constrained by their level of finance and investment? The other one was much more New Zealand farmer focused, where there's a whole heap of data around managing drench resistance and animal welfare and all of that stuff. And there's quite a fine balancing line, and there's some quite complex farm practices you can do to do that. And you can do testing, and you could probably use sensors and all of that sort of stuff. But that's highly complex. And so most farmers just have a few rules of thumb, and they say, I'm going to drench the sheep here, the ewes are going to follow the lambs, or whatever else it is, and there's a rule of thumb, and it's probably suboptimal. But on the other hand, maybe there is an economic balance that they've already achieved by kind of saying, well, I'm just going to use a rule of thumb rather than spend all of that time and the investment in the technology.
Great. That mention of education and also skills and also what's happening on farm is a nice sort of segue into the, I guess the sort of summary is that, we've talked about how digital technologies are changing agriculture and the food system from on-farm production, including supporting compliance to helping governments, improving the efficiency and effectiveness of policies and programs, and right across the value chain to the end consumer. But how can we ensure everyone benefits, considering potential issues related to data protection, cybersecurity, labor replacement and skills shortages, and the risk of actually further deepening the digital divide and its impact on communities and economies? If we want to sort of, one of you, I won't pick anybody in particular, want to kick off that conversation.
I might try. Oh, sorry. No, much better you do it, Claudia.
I just went for it, but I wanted to connect it with what we just talked about, right? I think, and I say that, and it might be provocative for that, but we want to have questions, so that's good. One farmer alone is not going to take a lot of advantage of technology. I mean, if it's a large farm operation, of course, but really you want to be able to compare. So you need to look for those aggregators. And those aggregators can be organizations that are input providers, those can be equipment providers, those could be insurances, banks. We really see consumer good companies, retailers, we see all of them coming to this market and creating digital solutions. And I think it's a good thing, because today a lot of the risk of farming really lays with the farmer, and we want to take this off farmer shoulders. Now, I completely understand there is fear and assumed risk with sharing data, and I also think we as an industry need to work on that and really work on concepts where we sort of secure the rights and secure the data of a farmer. But there's absolutely no doubt that we need those concepts of aggregation and running more broader digital ag systems. That's just my perspective on it.
I think at a market level, if consumers aren't satisfied with the products they're receiving, seeing how they're growing, or feeling that by buying a product they're contributing in some way to society or the planet or their own community, and moving away from those sort of concept of empty calories to something more meaningful to me as an individual. And I can't remember who mentioned personalized nutrition before. That's a big chunk. So I think individual farmers do benefit when data can flow through to the consumer that gives the consumer some confidence that the right thing is being done. Again, I don't think consumers want soil health and water data. They want to know a farmer, for example, a dairy farmer, is doing the right thing around water. And that's the farmer's benefit, because ultimately a retailer or a marketplace or a brand selling direct to market, the way we're seeing, Nestle and Danone and those big European corporates now going direct to consumer, as well as supplying via platforms, marketplaces, retailers, are starting to say, well, hang on, if you can't assure me of this, there's no way I'm risking my brand. And that's where even small farmers do have some advantages in terms of their ability to add value to their product and have be assured there's a customer or a consumer at the end of it. No consumer, no business. No farmer. If the farmer can't sell their product, it's over. And if you think back to the 1800s, everyone sort of bought flour from the local flour mill, and they knew who that was, and they probably knew the owner, and they probably went, socialized with the owner of the flour mill, and they had lots of trust. And what we've done over the preceding century or two is take away all of those systems in a search for efficiency. And what we now need to do is return to say, well, I still want to know how you do things. My ancestors used to be able to see that. Now I want to know in a digital way. So there is a benefit to every grower, every farmer, every supply chain participant. And then if I feel pretty good that you're handling the risk of food loss in your own production system and food waste at the consumer end, I'm pretty confident that 25% of food that's wasted that Bradley mentioned is going to start going to people who need it. And I'm going to resolve the calorie deficit. At the same time, I'm going to make myself healthier. I think there's so much benefit, and this rapidly changing expectation of consumers will frighten us. because, my mother knows how to use an iPhone pretty much as well as I do. She's 87 years old, and what Apple did was make it simple and digestible for her, and she could learn at her own pace, and she's got better and better. She even sends emojis. It's frightening. So we need to do that for the food system. And that goes to that question. The benefit to the farmer is make it simple, get them the data, let the consumer say, heck yes, I want to support Bob or Mary.
Yes, totally. I just given a totally unrelated idea, but really we should have emojis for seniors. Like seriously, like that yellow face is not,
You would probably say no, but anyway.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I just wanted to add. I mean, look, I think everything that Paul mentioned, I think is absolutely spot on. But I think all the problems we're talking about are really developed world problems, right? Frankly, in emerging countries, the developing countries, consumers don't want a choice. They just want food. They want food on their plate. They don't want a choice. Yeah. So they don't really care about how sustainable it was. They just want the food to get there. The problem we have is the farms are also very different, because the farms aren't going to implement technology. They don't have any capability to implement technologies, right? That's where it needs a very different level of push. And I guess, that's an area I'm sure, Bradley and his team are probably a lot more involved in, because that's where, the majority of the population is in the world. And the challenge in some of those countries is the farmers can't get their produce to the customer. It just rots. 90% of the produce will rot before it reaches the customer. So, it's a completely different view of food waste. So I think there's got to be some thinking around, and I know it might not be relevant to a New Zealand context, but I think, from a global context, I think there's got to be some thinking around how do you enable those solutions, because those solutions require a lot more than selling into a farmer a technology solution. It requires putting a weight behind it, and that's where various agencies and technology providers and governments need to look at some form of partnerships. And there is just such a strong need to focus on that, especially given the pandemic, because it's only going to get harder for those countries with unemployment, lockdowns. So also something just to consider.
Well, Bradley's going to pop on now and he's going to have something to say.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. Thanks, Janat and Amit. Yeah, so Amit's right. I mean, but that's precisely when I mentioned that through this Global Innovation Initiative that we're going out looking for digital farming technologies from the developing world that can be, from the global south, whatever phrase you want to use, but for the global south, right? So we're looking at solutions that aren't super, I mean, sure, they are using technology in really creative ways, but they're not so sophisticated, infrastructure heavy, and so expensive that they can't be used in the developing world context. So we're hopeful that these do translate well. Is it going to solve everything? Absolutely not. As you said, in the developing world, in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia even, much more vulnerable to even the most minor shocks. And so, when a pandemic happens like we're suffering now, I mean, if markets in say the US or Australia start to shutter or start to slow down, the ripple effects across the world in some of these places in Africa and South Asia are horrendous, and whatever digital technology you have in the world isn't gonna make a huge difference. But what's interesting too is how so there's digital agricultural technology, but it's linking also to financial access as well, right? It's the sort of FinTech and agri-tech nexus in a way, where it's also about getting farmers a lot more data, not just about their crops and the water supply and the weather, but also about their finances, right? And market conditions and connecting them to markets much better. So there's that whole part too around, not just financial inclusion, which I think is kind of an awful phrase now, but about how, what's a better way? Is it financial prosperity? Is it how do we use technology to help folks thrive, right? Especially in the developing world. So there are some really interesting opportunities there that kind of combine the increasing yields through, say, Internet of Things and so forth, but also digital finance that brings more financial security, not just food assurance, but financial assurance to farmers who need it the most in the developing world. So there are different angles for sure. You're not going to have a farmer in Kenya or Laos with a whole fleet of drones flying around, but you've got cool things like Hello Tractor. If you've not heard of Hello Tractor, but it's like the Uber for tractors that started out from Nigeria and sort of exploding in a sense through many countries in Africa. So all sorts of great ideas and innovations that are happening.
Can I just add one point on that? There's some great examples of what you just mentioned, Bradley, because you're absolutely right. I mean, this is where microfinance comes in. And there's a couple of great examples, and I'll take a farming one, agriculture one, and a non-agriculture one. From an agriculture perspective in Cambodia, but I'll give you a really interesting, mature example out of Bangladesh, because a very significant percentage of the population in Bangladesh is employed in the garment manufacturing sector, right? And consumers, so to the point that we were making earlier, consumers want a choice, and so the microfinance is big, has picked up really well in Bangladesh. And there's a couple of examples where they're trying to actually work with the small garment manufacturers that they're financing, enabling them with technology capabilities so that they can then offer a transparent view of the supply chain to customers, at the end customer. So whether it be a Gap or Zara or whoever. And what it does is it gets the financing into the manufacturer, but then the manufacturer is actually able to demonstrate that, because garment manufacturing is just very, very polluting to the environment, extremely polluting to the environment. So it takes care of addressing the, how environmentally friendly their manufacturing process was, but then also ensures visibility and transparency into fair wages and making sure there wasn't exploitation of labor and so on. So consumers could have choice. So to what Bradley was saying, there's some very simple solutions, just require a little bit of effort in terms of thinking of the higher impact that we can create. And I think New Zealand, for example, has a huge opportunity to go and enable some of these emerging countries. As a Kiwi living in Singapore, I take a lot of pride in that. I mean, we rank top of the charts for lots and lots of things, whether it's ease of doing business and so on. And I think agri-tech, obviously, we are a very advanced agrarian economy. So I think there's also an opportunity for New Zealand to take some of these practices and maybe apply those to some of these other problem areas.
And just to follow up on that, once again, I mean, we haven't talked about this, another aspect of all this data, right? Collecting data, integrating data from farmers and from agriculture. So a huge expense for farmers, no matter where they are in the world, is around insurance, right? So presumably, we can start using this proliferation of data on crop yields and water and everything else to really refine and make more efficient the insurance markets, right? So turning it from food data into financial data, right? That can really help farmers no matter where they are in the world, right? So I think this could have a hugely transformative effect, and I think really soon. I think it's to some extent already happening. So there's the data for farming, but that revolution, but there's a data for farm insurance revolution that's about to come.
I just want to go back to the point Amit made earlier, and that is, I think while a consumer perhaps in Kenya or other parts of Africa may not care so much about sustainability development goals as to getting enough food, but I do think consumers do care about safety and whether or not the food is safe. And I think farmers care about yields. So if they're buying fertilizers that aren't what they say they are, that can be 3 months worth of income lost in terms of not only yield, but the cost of the fertilizer. So there are some data points that farmers in those areas do care about. That doesn't mean we're going to go and rush a whole lot of internet-connected 5G driven applications into market with mixed reality. What it does mean is we need to reflect the technology state of the environment we're going into and simplify the solutions while adding that level of education that goes with it. But I think we've got to be careful in the tech world. We don't just say, I'm going to overcomplicate this process massively. There's going to be data everywhere, and there's going to be huge databases, and I'm going to write TensorFlow models, and I'm going to, machine learn the heck out of this and change your farm. I think consumers are saying, well, I want to make sure it's safe and not unsafe. And and if I'm a farmer, I really want to make sure what I'm putting onto my fields to improve yield is actually what it says it is. Might be a great place to start.
Yeah. Have I exceeded my airtime quota, Janet? Do I get another minute? I completely agree with what Paul is saying. And, all I'm saying is the problems are different, and there's a different approach we need to take to solve those problems. So if we take the example of the sub-Saharan African countries or South Asia, for example, or even parts of Southeast Asia, it's, governments have to have a role to play. And if you think about, we know there's 5G services that are going to be rolled out, and everyone talks about those things. How do you make them more meaningful? First of all, governments in these countries are going to be very, very short for cash to invest in technology. So it does require different kinds of public-private partnership models that would need to exist. Second, there needs to be a whole of sort of, I can't think of the term, but whole of agriculture sort of solution for those countries, right? Brought by those public-private partnerships. And, if you look at technologies such as digital twin, and, you touched on virtual reality, what the hell, I'll go ahead and give that example. The beauty of it is with these digital twins of farms, of equipment, of machines, of various assets, you can actually enable someone on the ground who's not really trained or qualified as an engineer, but with the help of someone sitting in a control room who is qualified, who has a digital twin of that particular farm, can actually enable the farmer to implement some of those things. Right? There are applications of technology, but I think those are probably more aspirational at the moment. But I think what it does, all I was trying to say was, I think it does require a larger perspective of how do you create a greater impact. And I think one of the things we've learned from the pandemic is a sense of empathy. And I think this is an opportunity to perhaps focus on that. And I think that's where my point was. I think New Zealand has a huge opportunity to take some of these technologies and focus on some public-private partnership models, whether it's working with global agencies such as Bradley's, whether it's UNDP or whether it's the World Bank, or there are various other organizations. But I think it requires a very holistic approach because those farmers aren't going to be able to implement or even view some of those on their iPhones because they don't have iPhones.
Thank you, Amit. So that ends the panel session, but what we've got is some Q&A coming through, and so I've had a chance to go through some of the questions, and I've got one for all the speakers now. Even if you have great systems, so even if we get the data right and we get that messaging to the consumer right, how do you tackle social influences that set out to destroy branding? So how do you compete with what's happening on social media when it comes to messaging to consumers around what's safe, what to buy? Any comments around that? Everyone's smiling.
I might start. So we look after about 80% of the infant milk formula brands out of region. We look after a lot of honey, a lot of wine, a lot of meat, nutraceuticals, etc. in terms of consumer engagement. So it's the brands that don't engage directly with their consumers that have to worry about destructive, opinionated social media hacks. And it's the brands engaging directly with their customers with a data backstory. And I think that's the key thing. If they show their customers, I've got the data, I can back up my story, and I care enough about you to tell you the story. They're not seeing the damage created by fake review or by maliciously minded KOLs in some markets. And they're also better able to navigate geopolitical changes that we're currently seeing, given the tensions in the world. They're able to actually engage again directly with consumers and avoid suffering the sometimes nationalist pride in some countries. So I think, yeah, one-to-one consumer engagement is what everyone's genuinely seeking.
There's a risk management aspect too, isn't there, Paul? Because if you are positioning your product with a certain set of credence attributes or a certain set of things that you're saying about your product, it's natural, it's unpolluted, then even before you get any pushback on that, you need to be saying, well, what could go wrong? What am I going to gather the data on and put in place so that I can stand behind that claim?
Yeah, glyphosate in honey is a good example, right? So we do look after a lot of honey, and all those brands are testing for glyphosate and are able to be absolutely sure of the quality of their raw material.
That's right.
Before they ship. So I think that's a really good example. It's risk management as well.
Yeah.
All right, another question here relates more to the Manuka honey industry, which is quite big in New Zealand. And most, I know people in Singapore and around the world enjoy Manuka honey from New Zealand. So what advice would you give the Manuka honey industry, given the recent noise here around traces of glyphosate, especially around how we better manage and reduce the use of glyphosate? Or is it something that we simply, nothing can be done about and we just wait for the media storm to pass?
I think I just unfortunately front-footed that one. No, I don't think you can wait for media storms to pass. I think there's two issues around Manuka in New Zealand, and one is this glyphosate story. And there are a lot of brands carefully avoiding glyphosate traces by testing for it. And if they have a batch of honey that is has a glyphosate traces, they don't go and package it and sell it as premium honey. So I think good honey companies are already protecting New Zealand reputation. So there's a bit of scaremongering in that. Our second problem is our Australian cousins have decided tea tree is actually Manuka, and so we're causing huge brand confusion as well. So I think you have to again have a brand story direct to consumer to say, I'm testing, I'm being careful, I'm controlling my supply chain, I'm controlling my raw material. And honey raw material in New Zealand is actually very well controlled. The MPI has done a great job of managing EDs through the process. So you can actually track generally hive to pot anyway. So test, and test again is the story of COVID world, but it's also the story of honey.
Anyone else on that topic around honey and glyphosate? No?
Yeah, we love Manuka honey.
It's not pure.
Good stuff.
Machine learning is used in that actually. Hill Laboratories here, isn't it, Andrew? In the Waikato do the machine learning algorithms in that space, which is interesting.
As well, I'm big in that. Yeah.
Yeah. Also from the Waikato, I believe. Just want to say.
They are the mighty Waikato.
The mighty Waikato, that's right. Fastest growing tech region in the country, 2 years in a row. Another question. Sorry?
I still support the Highlanders, I'm sorry.
I support Australia, so. But another question. So thinking about the supply chain, and we've talked about the social media impact in terms of messaging to consumers, and obviously we're here for consumers. And if we think of those that do use social media, so not the digital divide in this conversation, but what about other tools that consumers have access to? I know over COVID, Uber Eats was really big over here in New Zealand, probably in Singapore as well. That added cost and expense onto food. I mean, how does that then filter down that the farmers aren't getting any more? I guess the product is selling, but what is the incentive for farmers to use technology, and then how do you counter that investment and not increasing the price of goods, but actually that added cost then at the other end of the value chain when it comes to the consumer?
It's a real challenge, isn't it? And I was thinking about it earlier when we were talking about some of our other things that, when you're looking at adopting technology, full stop, you have to make sure you're not cargo culting. That's that fear of missing out thing again. you're actually you're looking at the value proposition for you. So if you're a farmer looking at technology, then look, it needs to do one of three things. It needs to enable you to sell or keep selling into the markets that you're wanting to target, or it needs to improve the price of what you're getting paid, or it needs to cut some costs out of your business. There has to be an efficiency or other sort of benefit. If you're doing it and it's just adding costs to your business and you could choose not to do it because the market doesn't require it, then you shouldn't be doing it. But so then there's a matching question, and I've had this conversation with companies, particularly supermarkets, in the sort of the more UK European context, where if you're going to demand those standards, are you going to pay any more? No, we're not. So where's the supply chain value?
But I might leave you if you don't look after my interests. It might be the bigger problem.
Yeah.
And you're seeing lots of disruptive brands enter markets and take on big traditional brands and win in many, many sectors. And, I look at plant-based protein and Impossible Burger and businesses like that. And their big advantage is actually supply chain, because they don't have to grow an animal to produce protein. They can store raw material for as long as they need to and respond to demand much faster. So supply chain is their big advantage. So I think the reality is, if you can't serve your customers' requirements, the rest is pretty irrelevant. So if you don't like Uber Eats, you need to find another local mechanism to deliver it. And I know there's a lot of noise in New Zealand about Uber Eats and how much they took from the restaurants, but I don't see the local alternative succeeding either. There's a lot of noise about it, but I still see Uber Eats numbers are pretty strong in New Zealand.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think even I used it twice before I realized actually they add extra cost to the cost of the food. I didn't know that.
And take some of the margin on the food. Yep.
Yeah, and I didn't know that. But at one point you couldn't go to the take. You were in New Zealand. We were on complete lockdown, so you couldn't even go and pick food up. Hey,
hi, Janet. Hi, Janet. So can I just add one extra thing on supply chain? This is Peter. I think again, really reflecting on the environment with which we're currently living in, this kind of moving on the post-COVID environment. I think supply chains are going to become much more local and regional. I think there are going to be a number of challenges for global supply chains. And just as an example, this morning I was speaking to a very good contact I have in North America, and they were talking about buying local. So obviously the North America is a very big area, but I think this concept of buy local is becoming more apparent. And so although we kind of bag our Australian colleagues occasionally, I wear two hats as well as looking after Agritech New Zealand. I'm also on the Australia-New Zealand Agritech Council. And just one great example of a recent joint initiative, we're both looking at seeing how we can develop research to address some of our water challenges. And so there's a Trans-Tasman Water Challenge, really looking at the issue of availability, management, quality. And I suspect there are going to be much more regional initiatives like this built up, not just in this region, but other parts of the world as we exit the post-COVID world, because people will be looking at that kind of more local regional environment in which to operate. So I think that's something we need to be cognizant of, that when borders are lifted, what happens before COVID is not necessarily going to be the same. The offshore landscape is going to be potentially quite different. And that's something certainly I, wearing my New Zealand hat, advise New Zealand agritech companies that when we are able to travel again, don't necessarily expect your markets to be thinking in the same way as they were maybe in January, February this year.
That's good advice, Peter.
It's a really good point also when it comes to where we started off from, which is global partnerships and collaboration. I was talking at the Agritech ITP launch the other day about how you need partners on the ground in other countries in order to support your exports. And I guess it's the same in terms of partners on the ground that can then add value to your product in terms of that sharing of data and the messaging to consumers. Any comments around that?
No, only just to confirm what you've said there, Jeanette. Absolutely critical for.
Yeah.
No, absolutely critical. And I know, as an organisation, and working with ITP, one of the work streams within ITP is called the global work stream. And the whole concept is, how do we improve our global footprint? So how do we ensure that New Zealand's agri-tech sector does have those connections in other markets to be able to scale? Because we are not necessarily in the edge of the world, but we're certainly quite a long way distant from some of those markets. And so having that internal support kind of networks is really important going forward.
Yeah.
And we're out of the world, isn't it? Because isn't the sunrise here?
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to add, I think New Zealand's capability around agriculture and farming and innovation in agriculture and farming is quite well known. I think that's what we're well known for. So I think from an agri-tech standpoint, there is a whole lot of positive branding that's already out there for New Zealand. And I think that there is a strong opportunity to actually make a difference. We've been at the cutting edge of innovation right from the start. I mean, go back 100 years and, everything from refrigerated shipping to, a whole bunch of other farm technologies in earlier days as well. So I think it's just about leading with some of those innovation stories.
Yeah, and look, I think we have this unique advantage in New Zealand because we are a small economy, and it's quite easy to get to senior executives in both large farming organisations and, of course, to farmers individually. But also we have a number of different food systems. So we're leading the way in regenerative, for example, or some people are leading the way in regenerative, I should say. And we have a great tech sector because we can go test on global brands in New Zealand, perfect, and then ship that offshore. Our farming systems aren't always the same as farming systems in other countries. So, for example, the way you produce milk in New Zealand is very different than the way you produce it in the US, for example. And but the capability, the tech savvy, and the ability to treat ourselves as a test bed. And I think it's quite telling that companies like Microsoft are building data centers here now. In this tiny little country at the bottom of the world, Microsoft's seen that there's going to be a lot of data flowing out of here that's useful, and as part of that, I don't want to call ourselves an incubator for tech, for global tech, but we're kind of like a microcosm of Silicon Valley in New Zealand, where you can pick up the phone, get to the decision maker, have a conversation, and get lots of really good feedback in a way you just can't in large corporatized farming systems, for example, or where there's lots of small landholders.
Yeah, the one thing I want to add, and Peter knows I'm a New Zealand fan, and everything I learned about New Zealand agriculture through, him and the visit there is just amazing. So I think a lot of the innovation I saw in New Zealand is driven by the macro needs that you have in New Zealand. And, we haven't talked about automation and labor issues at all today. I think that's one big area of innovation, but many others around supply chain, food quality, being able to measure sustainability footprint of a brand. I think I saw a lot of amazing work there. What I find working with startups is it's important to be very specialized, but it's also important to look over the pond, what else is out there. In fact, I see a lot of reinventing the wheel around the world when it comes to digital innovation. And I'm a big proponent of looking for some modular standard component and drive incremental innovation on top of those components. And really, this is also a concept that we're driving in Microsoft, no matter if it's for IoT devices or we talked a lot about digital twins or robotics or analytic models. It's like take a standard module, but then drive innovation on top.
Yeah, if I can also just add to that, Claudia, I don't know whether you heard, but Microsoft actually announced their first anchor tenant for their data center in New Zealand this morning, namely Fonterra. So in terms of agricultural data, there'll be no lack of data to have access to. So that announcement was only made in the last 24 hours.
Very exciting.
Great, isn't it, for the country? Yeah, like it's the ag with the tech together.
And look, I think we've got lots of examples where tech business has commoditized great tech. So, for example, if you think about wireless connectivity at home, and certainly in New Zealand, and this is becoming the case globally, that was all driven by Intel adding a Centrino chip, back in the early 2000s, sticking in a standardized Wi-Fi chip into Microsoft Windows machines, and they went everywhere, and suddenly people said, oh, I quite like this wireless thing at home as well. And it combined with ADSL and hybrid fiber coax in the US to create what we now know, and then created a whole business model around Netflix and compression. And where we all came from was a tech company saying, we're going to standardize this. You don't know what you need it for yet, but we're going to standardize it. And so we're seeing that again now. Lots of tech being standardized, democratized, made easier to get. And you'll just see that flowing across the world, including into poorer nations that don't have the infrastructure today. You'll see low Earth orbit satellites for internet access. You'll see a whole bunch of stuff occurring. And Rocket Lab, of course, putting up lots of low Earth orbit satellites out of New Zealand. It's nice to beat the Australians at the space race. Sorry, Peter. I know you've got an Australian hat on too.
If I can pick up on one final bit that Claudia said, we often in New Zealand, perhaps because of our distance to markets and maybe at the moment because of not being able to travel, there's a lot of reinvention going on. And so coming back to your original question, Janet, some of our partnering is not just about reaching markets. Some of our partnering needs to be about reuse of technologies and components and collaboration in those areas as well.
We've got probably about 30 seconds, I think, Chris, if you're there. But just sort of quickly, are we scared of AI? Is it taking jobs? Are we worried in the agriculture industry? I just want to pick up on Claudia's point around we didn't really deep dive into automation, but it's not the case. Yes, no.
No. I think if I can just say, I think human-machine collaboration actually has a tremendous amount of potential to create better employment opportunities. And my view is actually, humans aren't going to have to learn tech. Tech will have to learn how to help people. And that's what it's going to be. And we can elaborate on that separately. But I mean, the example of digital twins, for example, in virtual reality is one where you can create alternative employment opportunities without people actually having to be engineers. They can be skilled up. So I think qualifications will get trumped by skills. And I think human-machine collaboration, has a lot of possibilities. I'd love to get Claudia's thoughts on that.
I completely second this. It's really technology enabling human decision. I said this before. And I saw a comment about usability. Also, I think usability for me, to your point, completely comes from contextual advice, like how it's delivered. I mean, we can translate recommendations in different languages using cognitive services. We can call people, we can send text messages. It doesn't have to be even an app, but the important point, it's contextual. It's what I need right now on a farm, no matter if I'm rural farming or a developed world, to make a better decision now. I think that's really what's important.